Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's talk. I'm Ryan Martin. I'm the Associate Dean for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, or what we call CAUSE. I am super excited about tonight's talk, and we're going to get there in just a bit. First, though, I'd like to take a moment for the UW Green Bay land acknowledgement. We, at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation are the original first people of Wisconsin, and both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides upon. Today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nation communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Forest County Potawatomi, Ojibwe Nation communities, Stockbridge Munsee Band of the Mohicans, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. We acknowledge the First Nations people of Wisconsin. Now, before I introduce our speaker tonight, I want to talk with you a little bit about Common Cause and why we take the time to do this each year. This is actually our second Common Cause conference, and like last year, our goals are twofold. First, we want to showcase the amazing work of Cause students, alumni, faculty, and staff. And meeting this goal is pretty easy. The people in Cause are amazing, and it is a pleasure to help find an audience for their incredible work. Please take time this week to visit the website causeeffect.org. I'm going to post that link in the chat later to take a look at a lot of their work. Our second goal, though, is to highlight how Cause majors can contribute not just to our understanding of, but also the solutions to pressing problems. When it comes to the environmental crises we face, the majors in our college don't just play a role, they play a central role. If you take, for example, the climate crisis, much of the science is there. We understand the scope of the problem. We even understand a lot of what needs to be done to resolve it. What we lack is the human will to do the things we know need to be done. So how do you inspire people to take meaningful action when they don't want to? How do you change the hearts and minds of people in meaningful ways? Well, you do it through art and music and poetry and theater. You offer meaningful and thoughtful critiques of modern day capitalism, and you juxtapose those critiques with the history that got us here. You explore the ethics of the decisions we make each and every day. You make sure journalists are asking tough questions and writing stories that need to be written. You embrace scientifically backed behavior change practices. You find a way to turn those practices into policy. You investigate the politics and the economic structures that prevent those changes from happening. In short, you do the things we do every day in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. This is the stuff our college lives and breathes. It's what you find in our classrooms, and it's what you'll find in the programming throughout Common Cause all this week. So now, if you'll indulge me for just a minute longer before we get to the speaker, I have quite a few people I need to thank for their efforts in organizing the conference, starting, of course, with Dean Chuck Ryback. He has been steadfast in his support of this event, even serving as one of the presenters earlier today, and we are all very thankful. Thank you, Chuck. I also want to thank the Planning Committee co-chair, Dr. David Velker, who you're going to, who's going to take the virtual stage, if you will, in just a few minutes, but also the rest of the Planning Committee who are so instrumental, not just this year, but last year too. So Elise Cohen, David Corey, Diana Delbecchi, Kelly Desjardins, Caitlin Dolezal, Eric Morgan, Linda Peacock Landrum, Samantha Post, Courtney Sherman, Terry Turnus, Amanda Wildenberg. Thank you all so very much for your efforts. And Amanda Wildenberg is behind the scenes, not just tonight, but at all of the events, making sure that any tech problems get solved right away. So thank you all. So our speaker tonight is a professor of humanities and history. He has a PhD in United States history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is passionate about teaching the history of early America up to the Civil War, with a special focus on integrating First Nations. And he loves teaching courses on environmental history and environmental humanities, which explores the relationship between humans and the natural world. I am so very thankful for his work on the conference this year. Please welcome Dr. David Velker.
All right, thank you so much, Ryan, for that lovely and kind introduction, not just to me, but to Common Cause. I thought that was really wonderful what you said about the work that the college does. I'd like to second all the gratitude that you shared, and I will share some of my own. As Ryan noted, I teach and study history and humanities, but I want to be clear that I'm attempting to speak tonight, not just as a scholar, but as a whole person. I've been able to learn a lot from traditional research, but I've also been very fortunate to learn from First Nations elders and a number of other elder teachers, as well as from youngers, including my son, who just turned 12 and who's keeping himself occupied while I talk, and from many wonderful experiences of community and of dialogue. I deeply appreciate the UWGB land acknowledgement that Ryan shared. We call it a land acknowledgement, but it's about the people who have belonged to this land since time out of mind. And although it's a very gentle statement, it's also an essential reminder of a history of colonization and dispossession, as well as of tremendous resilience. I wouldn't be giving this talk tonight without many generous gifts I've received in the form of teachings from First Nations elders and my colleagues in First Nations studies. My published acknowledgements for this talk, which are in the Q&A, include a longer list of gratitudes, including to Napus and Dr. Carol Cornelius, who have long served UWGB as elder teachers. And I'd also like to name Dr. Rosemary Christensen, our retired colleague, from whom I have learned so much. And I must thank my First Nations Studies colleagues and friends, Lisa Pupar, Forrest Brooks, and JP Leary, who've been so supportive of my work over many years. I try to carry these teachings and relationships with me in everything that I do, though that does not mean that they would necessarily agree with everything I say here tonight. Thanks also to my dear friend and colleague, Allison Staudinger, who will guide us through your questions at the end. Finally, I'd like to thank my wife, Nicole, and my son, James, both of whom, in their own ways, helped me think through this talk. These acknowledgements are not incidental to what I would like to say about moving beyond sustainability. For one thing, I'm not claiming to have invented any of the ideas that I'll talk about, and I want to recognize verbally, and in my written acknowledgements and sources, some of the many people from whom I've learned. Even more importantly, it's a basic teaching of First Nations and also a core practice of the work that reconnects, which I'll speak about later, that we start from gratitude. Doing so honors our interdependence and casts light even in dark times. The description of this event stated that we need to have an honest conversation about sustainability, not to demolish the concept, but to recognize that it has fallen short in helping us change our unsustainable ways. In my talk this evening, I'd like to focus on several aspects of the public discussion of sustainability in order to suggest a more honest, expansive, and holistic approach. We can't begin to talk honestly about sustainability until we come to terms with unsustainability and the harm we've caused on this living planet, including harm to each other. To do that, we have to see things holistically and as whole beings. We need sustainable knowledge systems that recognize multiple ways of knowing. And we need a more robust media system that shares accurate information and supports honest dialogue. We'll need to pay more attention to the connections between environmental issues and social and racial justice. Above all, we'll need to be more imaginative to envision futures in which we thrive together as members of the larger community of life. In a short talk, I can only scratch the surface of these topics, but fortunately we have a whole week this year devoted to the Common Cause Conference. Nearly 3 decades of studying history has prepared me to look carefully at the past, to try to understand it, and to accept what has happened as a reality. There's no question that we need this knowledge about where we are and how we've gotten here. We also need scientific knowledge based on careful measurements and analysis of atmospheric, soil, and water chemistry, for example, to understand how human activity is affecting the community of life to which we belong. This knowledge, produced by instrumental rationality, what we might call mind, as Rosemary has told me that Anishinaabeg elders sometimes do, is essential in this time, but it is not sufficient. Mind, detached from body, heart, and spirit, has too often been a destructive force. It's strange that in the Western world, we use the word mindfulness to name the integration of mind and body through meditation. We'd probably do better to call it heartfulness, as Stephen Murphy Shigematsu suggests. Ancient wisdom traditions from Southeast Asia recognize that we can focus on our breath or movement to use the experience of embodiment to integrate mind with heart or spirit. I use the word spirit here not to mean something supernatural or unnatural, but rather to bow to the profound interconnectedness of all existence. Working alone, the mind of instrumental rationality has a tendency to forget this fundamental fact, as it gets lost in treating everything outside of itself as an object, sometimes including other humans. As Robin Wall Kimmerer has observed, all too often we it the world. I want to be clear that I'm not disparaging science, far from it, but we can't move towards sustainability without developing sustainable systems of knowledge, which means honoring multiple ways of knowing. As I was preparing for this talk, I listened to Robin Wall Kimmerer read the introduction to her book, Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. I've read this book more than once, and I've learned more than I can say from Kimmerer's many writings and talks. She's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, she's an academic botanist, and she's a carrier of traditional knowledge. Kimmerer helps write the April 2017 Indigenous Science Declaration titled, "Let Our Indigenous Voices Be Heard," which was a contribution to the March for Science. The statement reads, in part, "Western science is a powerful approach, but it is not the only one. Indigenous science provides a wealth of knowledge and a powerful alternative paradigm by which we understand the natural world and our relation to it. Embedded in the cultural frameworks of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and reverence for the earth, Indigenous science lies within a worldview where knowledge is coupled to responsibility and human activity is aligned with ecological principles and natural law rather than against them. We need both ways of knowing if we are to advance knowledge and sustainability." Kimmerer has also said, "Science polishes the gift of seeing. Indigenous traditions work with gifts of listening and language." Part of what she means, I think, is that we might learn from, as well as learn about, plants and other living beings with whom we share the planet. In her introduction to Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer shares the story of Sky Woman falling, which is an important part of the creation beliefs of the Potawatomi and many other First Nations of the Great Lakes region. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to tell the story, so I'll have to point you to Kimmerer's retelling. But as I listened to her read the story, I found myself moved to tears. And this wasn't the first time that this creation story has affected me in this way. It includes what many Native people call original instructions, teachings about how to live well on the earth in respectful relationship with all our relations. For me, this story, in which many animal beings collaborate to assist Sky Woman, conveys the insight of interconnectedness in a way that both enlightens my mind and awakens my heart. But the tears I shed in these moments are not nearly enough in the face of unsustainability. We are driving a gigantic machine toward a vast dark chasm, greater than any yet experienced by human beings. This machine, the global industrial economy, is made of countless interacting parts that extend far beyond the human horizon in terms of both time and space. It has taken on a kind of life or death of its own. No one individual or group controls the machine or can grasp its impacts in the past, present, or future. We drive before us plant and animal species, some of whom we don't even know about. Glaciers and ice sheets pour themselves into this chasm. Scientists have been warning us for decades about this calamity, but we couldn't always see it for ourselves. And what we could see instead, what captivated our attention, seemed so dazzling. Many of those people who are paying attention have long ago rejected optimism, have even given up hope in the usual sense of the word. Some have fallen into despair, but something remains beyond optimism, beyond hope, beyond despair, and that's responsibility. Regardless of how dire the situation becomes, we are still responsible for our action and inaction in this time. It's already too late to stop many disasters of human-caused climate disruption, just as it's already too late to save the many species who have gone extinct. But our everyday actions and collective decisions will still determine the scope and scale of these tragedies. We know with certainty that the chasm lies ahead and we draw closer with every passing day. But the truth is, we don't know how near or how far it might be. Many of the calamities that lay in store for us and most living beings on the planet emerge from non-linear systems, meaning that change might appear to be gradual, even imperceptible to the untrained eye. But there is an unseeable line out there that, once crossed, could trigger a cascade of consequences, splitting the ground in front of us. Amitav Ghosh and others have characterized these nonlinear cascading changes as unthinkable. Unthinkable because they don't meet the expectations of our everyday experience. And perhaps also unthinkable because we simply don't want to think about them, much less feel into these losses. We no longer have any choice, however, as we observe the worst wildfire season in recorded history in many Western states, and a record-breaking tropical storm and hurricane season that ran us out of prepared names and into the Greek alphabet. These ecological crises have been a long time in the making, and it was widely understood by the 1960s and 1970s that human activity was ravaging the life support systems of the earth, fouling the air and water, contaminating and depleting the soil, and destroying the habitats and lives of countless species. Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, and many others wrote eloquently about these problems. In 1977, John Mohawk, a scholar, writer, and activist of the Seneca Nation, spoke at an international gathering in Switzerland, and he delivered a message to the Western world from the Haudenosaunee people. He said, "The way of life known as Western civilization is on a death path, on which their culture has no viable answers. When faced with the reality of their own destructiveness, they can only go forward into areas of more efficient destruction." He went on to say, "The destruction of native cultures and people is the same process which has destroyed and is destroying life on this planet." Mohawk explicitly and insightfully connected the ways in which, and I quote, "humans are abusing one another, they are abusing the planet they live on, and they are even abusing themselves." Here, we can see the various facets of the unsustainability crisis spelled out. And this was before the problem of human-caused climate disruption was widely understood. I've been quite stunned to study the writings from that time and to see how much people understood then and how passionately people fought for change. In 1967, in a highly influential article in the journal Science titled "The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis," historian Lynn White Jr. concluded, "We must rethink and re-feel our nature and destiny." This holistic plea for cultural transformation was published in Science over a half-century ago. As far as I know, the history of how the sense of urgency about the ecological crisis faded, how that sense of urgency faded, has yet to be written in full. But my rough draft explanation is that these insights were lost in the glare of neoliberal ideology and in the dazzling light of the digital revolution. And ironically, meaningful environmental legislation in the United States and other affluent nations perhaps made it easier to ignore the big picture of continuing degradation. Two of our greatest problems in this moment are denial, still informed by that ideology, that is to say neoliberalism, and the corporate power that goes with it, that elevates short-term economic considerations above all others, and disinformation, which has been supercharged by the ongoing technological revolution. Disinformation and denial have become industries of their own, bought and paid for by fossil fuel corporations and ideologues who fear government regulation more than they fear hurricanes, floods, and firestorms. If you'd like to learn more about that, check out the Merchants of Doubt citation in my sources list. It's become difficult to have open, honest conversations in this country among people of diverse views because we have a media environment that has steadily fanned the flames of disinformation, misinformation, and division for many years. We have a long way to go to achieve a sustainable media system, by which I mean a system that maximizes the transmission of useful, accurate information and civil dialogue while minimizing the influence of disinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories, and trolling. As individuals, we are small in the face of these problems, but we must take responsibility for what we share, what we like, and what we choose to direct our attention toward. But the problem of denial goes beyond the refusal to accept the overwhelming scientific consensus about human-caused climate disruption and the loss of biodiversity, or even the rejection of the overwhelming consensus among people of color, as well as social scientists and humanists, that systemic racism is real, is a matter of life and death, and must be addressed. We need to own that we are all participating, albeit in varying degrees, in systems that are unsustainable, that are contributing to climate disruption, that are destroying habitat for plant and animal species, and that are endangering the living planet, while also generating harmful inequality among humans, especially on the basis of race. The discourse of sustainability, unfortunately, has played a role in supporting our collective denial of these facts. Just to be clear, I recognize that many of us here accept these facts as true, but we often deny them through our everyday behavior, as Hope Jahren has pointed out. We deny them when we pretend that we can sustain the status quo if we buy a hybrid, install LED light bulbs, and recycle our Amazon.com boxes. The fact is that the status quo is so profoundly unsustainable in so many ways, quantitative and qualitative, that we must dive deeper into our minds, hearts, and imaginations, individually and collectively, than the discourse of sustainability has led us to do. I propose that we work together to imagine an ecological future. And as I'm saying this, I want to be clear, I'm not the first person to make this proposition, to suggest this. I want to note that I deliberately avoid the phrase ecological civilization, which is gaining currency, because I think it's problematic for a number of reasons. First, civilization suggests one unified global system, which I think misses the ways in which we need to relocalize and adapt to local conditions, while it also raises questions about centralized authority. Second, the word civilization itself has too often been used as a weapon. Today, white nationalists promote Western civilization as a way to denigrate the people and cultures of the global South, as well as people of color within the United States. Moreover, in the past, the United States government explicitly used what was called civilization policy to destroy First Nations cultures. I doubt that this word can be freed from these associations. Having explained that, I'd like to focus on the role of the ecological imagination in this work of moving beyond sustainability. Robin Wall Kimmerer has said that it is our moral imagination that will shape our futures as much as any technology or policy. Here we can see the crucial role that the arts, humanities, and social sciences have to play in a larger collaboration to transform our society. Each of these domains of knowledge has an essential role to play. Many cause faculty have already made contributions. For the Common Cause Speaker Series, Professor Alison Staudinger inquired into the challenges of making good choices despite profound limitations of our circumstances and of our knowledge. And she encouraged us to, and I quote, build collectivities in which we can imagine better futures and feel more connected with people to whom we are connected, or with whom we are connected. Professor Elizabeth Wheat showed crucial connections between environmental problems and racial justice. And Chris Williams explored how eco-poetry can build our capacity for recognizing interconnection, acknowledging other than human lives, and taking responsibility for the impact of our behaviors on the community of life. Later this week, philosopher Zan Bazo will ask that we reimagine the ethical responsibilities of multinational corporations. Luis Fernandez in music will be sharing a performance and talk about African-American classical composer Florence Price, which can help us think about cultural sustainability. There are many more offerings, which, as Ryan said, you can find at causeeffect.org. As I've already suggested, Indigenous knowledge systems also have a central role to play in this work. Speaking in 2008 at the University of Arizona, Onondaga faithkeeper Oren Lyons said to a predominantly white audience, "You're going to have to find your ceremonies again. You're going to have to find a way to give thanks, to get your relationship back, to understand how closely you're related to the trees you're cutting down, grandfathers." He did not mean that European Americans should appropriate Indigenous culture. Rather, he was pointing out that the dominant culture lacks an effective way to sustain a reciprocal relationship with the living earth, and also to sustain relationships between present-day people and their ancestors and descendants on down to the 7th generation. One of the most creative attempts to reestablish these relationships is the work that reconnects, whose root teacher is Joanna Macy. Central to this work is a 4-step spiral movement. Step 1 is gratitude. Step 2 is honoring our pain. Step 3 is seeing with ancient and new eyes. And step 4 is going forth and taking action in the world. I began this talk with gratitude and have acknowledged the importance of traditional knowledge alongside scientific insights. I'd like to go a bit deeper into the second step, honoring our pain, before moving on to the final step of going forth. Honoring our pain and the pain of all the other beings with whom we are connected must play a role in the process of restoring our relationships. Until we honor our pain, we're either in denial or lost in numbness. As Francis Weller has written, grief is essential to finding and maintaining a feeling of emotional intimacy with life, with one another, and with our own soul. We cannot learn from our suffering until we actually attend to it, individually and collectively. And the first step is accepting that the harm and losses are real and feeling the grief that comes with that. We could dwell here for a long time, but for now, let's move on to the final stage of the spiral, going forth. What might we carry forward from this exploration? One of the great conundrums regarding sustainability is that so many basic human needs remain unmet. Inequality between wealthy and developing nations is especially egregious, but we can also see dramatic inequality inside affluent nations like the United States. Moreover, climate disruption will amplify these inequalities. With that in mind, I want to be clear that I support the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which do require continuing economic growth in some areas. I also want to recognize that the pandemic has generated tremendous economic pain for many working people the world around, and we need to do a much better job of protecting people from economic downturns. All of that is crucial to sustainability. However, to talk about unlimited growth, which is commonplace, would seem to be delusional thinking, and it's part of what got us where we are today. Perhaps we can grow our way out of our interrelated social and ecological crises, but not in the usual way of the industrial growth economy. What do we need to grow if not simply the gross domestic product? Can we grow new stories about what it means to be a good human in these times? Can we grow new strategies for meeting basic human needs? Can we grow our capacity for listening, dialogue, and collaborative problem solving in order to avoid violent divisions? Can we grow new questions such as, what does it mean to be a good ancestor? Which echoes the ancient principle of the Haudenosaunee to make your decisions on behalf of the 7th generation coming, as Oren Lyons has put it. Can we grow regenerative systems that are dynamic, resilient, equitable, restorative, and that put us in reciprocal relationship with the community of life? I think the answer to all these questions is yes, and we must. And fortunately, even though that sense of urgency that I was talking about earlier in the 60s and 70s, even though that faded in the population at large, there were a lot of people in this country and elsewhere around the world for whom that did not fade. And they've actually sustained these conversations. So everything that I'm talking about there is, it's already underway. All those things are happening. People are talking about all of these things. I can imagine that many of you listening would like to have concrete actions that you can take. We want to be able to do things like change light bulbs, and we should. But we also need to think about how we can use the fires of our gratitude and grief to cast light on what matters most, and how we can use science as a searchlight on our universe to understand our proper place, rather than simply as the sharpener of our sword, as Aldo Leopold said. And how we can use our imaginations to light up alternative futures that restore our broken relationships with each other and with the community of life, rather than pretending that with a few minor tweaks, we can maintain the status quo. I'd like to close with a 4-word sentence from Robin Wall Kimmerer. All flourishing is mutual. And I need a second to fix my screen before I finish my comments on that. Sorry about that. So all flourishing is mutual. If we grant that this statement is true, what does it say about the meaning of flourishing? How is that meaning different than what we might usually think about in the industrial growth society? What wisdom can we find there? What would it mean to take this principle seriously if we make decisions at every scale, from personal and familial on up to national and global? This statement, for one thing, breaks down the divisions between humans and other beings that inhabit Earth, just as surely as it breaks down the divisions among humans on the basis of race, socioeconomic class, nationality, and other differences. To move beyond sustainability, to explore together the meaning and means of mutual flourishing, that would be a good common cause for a university. Thanks, everybody, and I look forward to some discussion now.
Great, thank you so much. So I think I'll start with some of the questions that are here in the chat, and feel free to keep adding some more. There's one question that's asking you to maybe think about sources outside the US, even though I know you're a US historian. I'm wondering if you see connections between the sort of sources you're drawing on and other maybe anti-colonial thinkers, such as Mahatma Gandhi suggested here, or do you see kind of international connections here? How would you think about this in a more international framework, David?
Yeah, thanks, Allison, and thanks for that question. I think it's a really good one, and you know, I alluded to some of the perspectives from Southeast Asia in terms of maybe the basic intellectual style of the Western world, and certainly there are many critiques there that have made their way to the United States, to the Western world, and really do influence our culture and conversations today. Of course, as I talked quite a bit about First Nations and those perspectives, those are also from outside of the Western world of Europe and colonization. And I think certainly there's a lot of critiques of colonialism that really do tackle these subjects. It's not an area where I have enough expertise to speak about it fluently, but I do think it's important to recognize that there's tremendous cultural diversity around the world, including many other indigenous cultures, and that there are scores of critiques of this dominant culture coming out of the West that has colonized the globe through capitalism primarily. Well, not just capitalism, because we see it with socialism as well, and it's one of the reasons why I talk about the industrial growth economy as opposed to just capitalism, because I think the roots of the problem are even more expansive than just capitalism. So yeah, I don't have a particularly specific response to that, except to say yes, absolutely. And Allison, you may have something, not to put you on the spot for this, but you may have thoughts about that as well.
I don't know that I particularly do, but
we're both Americanists, I know, but
yeah, I like the question. I like the kind of pushing to think of those connections.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think partially I don't have anything to say because I'm thinking through my own question, which I'm going to be a bad moderator and start here and then get to some of the other great questions in the chat. But I'm just thinking about, it seems like part of what you're saying is that mutual flourishing is a more generative set of concepts or concepts than sustainability, that it does some of the work of helping us think through the way that race and inequality, but also a lack of imagination has maybe caused us some problems. I'm wondering if you think that mutual flourishing, because of the way that it demands that we think about other beings, helps with the urgency problem that you sort of started us with, or is that kind of a separate, if interrelated, problem?
Wow. There's maybe a couple questions hidden in there, huh? Well, I want to just say again, I mean, I quoted Robin Wall Kimmerer a number of times here, and of course that four-word sentence, "all flourishing is mutual," comes from Kimmerer, so it's not my idea, but I do think that it provides maybe a much more powerful mode of thinking than sustainability. And that's in part because, sustainability is often, our discourse there is often about things we need to maybe simply just cut back on, or, restrictions and so forth. And I agree that we need to do those things, but this is a more forward-looking vision for how we might transform our society in a way that is respectful of the needs of not only all humans, but all the other beings that are part of this larger community of life. And I'm not just using that as like as an analogy. If we think about this from scientific perspectives, as well as from many cultural perspectives, like the idea of the community of life is a reality. Without all those other beings, we humans, we don't exist, first of all, but we don't have a future. We don't have a chance. And at this point, at this stage in human history, it's also true that all those other beings really do depend for their future security on our decisions and our behaviors because of the scale of our economies and technologies and so forth. So I think mutual flourishing kind of puts out there a real goal that's very different from let's just try to sustain what we're doing. You know, that whole question of what is it we're trying to sustain so often gets lost when we talk about sustainability. So the default is, well, we'd actually like to pretty much keep on doing what we're doing without having to make any serious changes. We're just gonna, you know, tweak this and that. And that vision, it's not much of a vision. I mean, let's be honest. And I think mutual flourishing really does put something out there that we could really work toward. Not that it's, I realize like that doesn't define all of our goals, but it can become the basis of creating a vision, co-creating a vision to work on together as a, you know, in local communities, but as I said, like scale that all the way up to the global community. Did I answer your question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a hard question, but I think it's a question that Elise Cohen asked in the chat, which is pointing to the ways in which imagining new ways of being has been a common theme so far. And so she asked, what are some ways we can collectively incentivize imagination and creativity as a university and community?
Wow. See, that's a really good question about like actually doing something. And part of what I was getting at here is like the work of imagining, like that is an action, like that's a behavior. It's something that we can do and we need to do together. So I really appreciate that question. I do think that, you know, like this conference, like having a College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, having a sustainability requirement at the university, sustainability minor, where we are, I mean, if you look at the learning outcome there, there's an expectation when we think about sustainability that we're looking at looking at the debate about sustainability. But how do we incentivize really imagining? I think part of it is really starting to value that kind of work. Like think about what sort of work a science fiction novel, for example, could do, or a piece of poetry, or a history that really clearly shows us how and why we've been so slow to deal with climate change. And by the way, I mean, that book's already been written, Merchants of Doubt, which I cite in my sources. But that kind of imaginative and exploratory work, you know, we can incentivize that through our, as I suggested, our media systems, our knowledge systems. And we can continue to promote this kind of work through the university, which means even as we're expanding pre-professional programs, which are really important, we need to think about how do we include these kinds of disciplinary and interdisciplinary inquiries in a college degree, not just here at UW Green Bay, but at universities around the world. And there has been a definite shift away from that kind of really promoting the role of arts, humanities, and social sciences in the curriculum. So, I'm interested in hearing other ideas people have. I don't really think I have any revolutionary ideas about exactly how to incentivize that. But step one would be recognizing, like, this is really important work. It's not just some kind of fluff. And it's often seen that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of struck by, in your talk, you used a lot of words that were connected to seeing and attending or paying attention to. And I think it, in a literal sense, but it also seemed to be in part about, what would it mean to polish a gift of seeing that's about imagination, right? Not just seeing what's in front of you or other ways of seeing, or what does it mean to pay attention? And I think that ties nicely to what you just said about pointing to art and multiple fields. There was a question, someone in here that was just sort of asking if you had recommendations for, let's see, how did they put it? It was nice. Narratives embracing perspective and sort of inspire that, maybe polishing the gift of imagination or seeing. Are there things that you'd like to share? And it could be later too, I suppose.
So Allison, you cut out for just a second there on the sort of core part of the question. So what was the what were the perspectives the person was looking for? I'm trying to look in the chat.
Just various perspectives and forms, written or filmic. I think they're thinking about ways of knowing, or other ways of other beings' perspectives that we might be attuned to.
Oh, right. Oh, well, so, I of course immediately think of My Octopus Teacher, which you introduced me and the world to. Well, Netflix was there too, I suppose. But a book that really made a huge impact on me, that came out in, I'm pretty sure 2018, and you and I have talked about this, is The Overstory, which really moves us into thinking about trees and the complexity of trees and the relationship between trees and humans. And I think that's a nice complement to Robin Wall Kimmerer's work as a botanist. She actually focuses on moss in her research and has written a book about moss. But there's a wonderful a panel discussion that I included on my sources. That's a conversation between, let me just pull this up here so I can make sure I get this right. Sorry, I'm being slow now. Let's see here. It's underneath. Sorry for this little pause. It's called Tales of Sweetgrass and Trees, Robin Wall Kimmerer and Richard Powers with Terry Tempest Williams, panel discussion from last year. And so they are talking about their respective works, but The Overstory is a novel, and it's a very unique novel in the sense that not all the main characters are humans. So that'd be one example. Nothing else is rushing to my mind right now, but I'll think about that, and that could be something could add to my list of sources. But that's a good place to start, and it would take probably 8 or 10 hours to read The Overstory, which I do highly recommend.
All right. Do you want a hard political question or a difficult theoretical question?
Let's start with a hard political question. I'm assuming you're going to help me with both of these.
Oh, great. So someone points out, this is an honest question, that some of those folks who are deniers or resistant to climate change are on the right, at least in the United States, but in Europe, we have a history of the far right sort of embracing environmentalism, eco-fascism. And so the question is, could you see them working together, the far right and the far left, towards a common environmental policy? And I think in particular, because of what you said about the importance of connecting racial justice movements to environmental justice movements. It's kind of a pregnant question.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, here in the United States, I mean, we're in a very poignant, perhaps transitional moment. It's not clear how long that, you know, that transition will be underway to allow us to sort of predict what's even possible. But so right now, it's really hard to imagine the hard right and the you know, ultra progressive left really doing a whole lot of collaboration. Having said that, I was listening today to a story about a news story about the economic toll, just the damage done by the hurricane season in the United States this year. And we're not talking about a few $100 million or even a couple $1 billion. Like, it's many billions of dollars of direct damage done, not to mention the long-term economic impact. And so, you know, really soon here, if it hasn't already happened, it's going to become clear to everyone that we're going to have to work together to address climate change, simply to protect, you know, our economies. And, you know, I've already spoken to ways in which I think the economy needs to be radically transformed. So I don't know how that would play out here, but I do think that, like, self-interest, while it's not enough, it's going to play a much greater role over the coming decades than it has in the past few decades when it comes to dealing with environmental issues. And I guess what I mean by that is people who have wealth and power, it's going to be in their self-interest to start taking meaningful action in the way that it was in the 1970s. And again, historically, I think that it had a couple of effects. I mean, it had a kind of backlash effect, which I spoke to. So the rise of neoliberalism, and it also made things here in the United States seem like they were much better. I mean, we didn't have, you know, rivers on fire, at least not nearly as often, because of some new regulations, and that meant that there was a real relaxing of that sense of urgency. But I think we're moving into a time where that sense of urgency could drive some bipartisan action. Now, again, I don't know if I fully answered that question. I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think the challenge is, you know, at what point, if there's a ecological movement that's, you know, committed to, that's willing to partner with you, you know, at what point does that coalition become one that you're not, you know, not willing to build? But we're certainly a long way from there right now.
Right, exactly.
There's quite a few questions that are sort of asking you to think about overcoming divisions and, you know, how to overcome those divisions to help people listen. And so one way of thinking about that is a question from Chris, where he says, what role do you see hierarchical and non-hierarchical structures playing within these systems? The systems that you're talking about, which he characterizes as dynamic systems, ones that are vibrant, typical, and foreground, breaking down divisions. And then there's a few other questions that are also thinking about how do we communicate across divisions. So
yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. And you're right that a lot of the, well, I mean, I will say a lot of the cultural influences at work in my talk, and, you know, things, people I'm quoting from, and a number of experiences I've had, they do tend to be really non-hierarchical structures. And it is true that, you know, getting things done quickly is very difficult to do in a non-hierarchical structure. And I will say, you know, I mentioned Rosemary Christensen. One thing that she has told me a number of times, and I really try to remember this, is that a hierarchical system, for all of its shortcomings, can at times get things done quickly and efficiently. And that is a, you know, a check mark in its favor, assuming that the means and the ends are good. So I do think that maybe, you know, we're still going to need to have, I shouldn't say maybe we're still going to need to have, I don't anticipate a time anytime soon when we don't have national governments and international structures that are hierarchical. But I think there can be a lot of work done at the local level, at the community level, and really at the personal level that happens in non-hierarchical structures where we really practice listening, practice dialogue. I mean, those are things that by their nature happen in relatively small groups, and we can build a capacity to do that. I mean, it takes practice. It's an action, it's a behavior. So put that on your to-do list along with, you know, switching over to LED light bulbs. Try to participate in dialogue where you really have to listen and be respectful. Now, I know that that's easier said than done, and it takes a skilled facilitator at times to make that happen. In other words, to bring a group of people, diverse views, to a place where they really can speak and listen without it becoming a kind of battle. But, you know, there are people out there who know how to do this and who've worked with that and have been doing so for a long time. So that's a capacity that we can build. It will require, and it does require people to, you know, take some interest in that. And frankly, I mean, at this point, that's going to be a survival skill going forward. It always has been for humans, and we're going to need that because our challenges are going, you know, I imagine going forward are going to be quite a bit harder than, say, dealing with this pandemic, as rough as it's been. I'll stop there because there might be one more. Maybe we have time for one more quick question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully this
or a
pulls
thorny
in a
theoretical
few of the,
question.
No. Hopefully this pulls together a few of the threads that are out there because there's lots of great questions that we couldn't quite get to. But I'm just thinking about building on what you just said about practices that we can put on our to-do list. I was just so struck by the way you began from acknowledgements and gratitude. And you spoke a little bit about why that was important to you. But I just wonder if you have any, for other things we can put on our to-do list, any thoughts about gratitude, a more part of our individual and communal practices, either as a university or as a community.
So how do we make gratitude a practice that we're yeah, well, I mean, I haven't done this myself, but I know that there is a movement for people, encouraging people to keep a gratitude journal, and it can just be at the end of the day, just write down, you know, a couple things you're grateful for. So there is like a personal practice you can do for that. You don't have to write that down. I mean, that could just be something, it's an intention that, you know, before you fall asleep each night, you think of something you're grateful for. And I think that's something you can do. I'll be honest, I don't think that we do a very good job with gratitude as a collective practice either, meaning we don't with grief, that's for sure. Now, you know, we do, like, so when Ryan began this event, he thanked people. But there's a more comprehensive kind of gratitude. And I think here about the Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian Thanksgiving address, which can take a day. It certainly takes many hours. I mean, it's a ceremonial practice in traditional Haudenosaunee culture, when there's a gathering of people to make a decision, to conduct diplomacy, to really do just about anything, it starts with gratitude. And that includes thinking about all of our relations, all the human relations, but also the relations with the living planet, and of course thanking the creator. So it's a spiritual practice. I don't really think that we have anything quite like that in the dominant culture, but it can be a way to build common ground, and that's really it's one of the functions of that Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, because we can, if we give gratitude for all those things that all of us are dependent upon. You need to have clean water. You need to have healthy food to eat. You need to have shelter, and so forth. Whether you are, if we think about the United States today, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, like these are all things that we need. We all have to breathe clean air, or we're going to be sick, and our loved ones are going to be sick, and so forth. So I think maybe if we did more of that, it might open us up to some common ground that we could build on. So I'm really actually grateful that you ended with that question, because I think it's really important, and it's not a coincidence that that's just a foundational, essential practice among indigenous cultures. And the Haudenosaunee example is particularly striking, but I think that practice is, or something like that, is widespread. So maybe that's something that we in the dominant culture could learn from. Thanks. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I want to thank everybody for your questions. And I think, Ryan, we can save those questions so I can take a look at them all later. Is that right? Hopefully. Yeah, and yes. Thanks, Allison, for guiding me through the questions. I really appreciated that help.
All right. Thank you so much, David Belker. That was fabulous, fabulous stuff. I want to thank Allison Stonier as well for moderating the Q&A. That was wonderful. And I do want to remind people about the keynote on December 2nd. That's Wednesday from 6 to 7 p.m. I threw the link to that event in the chat earlier. And just to note, this one's going to be via Zoom instead of Teams, so a little different. But the link to join is in the event. So once again, thanks to Amanda, David, Allison for participating tonight, and then also thanks everybody else on the planning committee that I mentioned at the beginning. Wonderful stuff so far, and we got a lot of great talks throughout the rest of the week. So please join us again. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.